So our topic for today is judgment under uncertainty and how error management theory, which I'm going to call EMT, can help us understand that from an evolutionary perspective. Uncertainty is ubiquitous in human life, and it's why we laugh at Yogi Berra's famous saying, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And our brain is designed to help us decide what fork to take by predicting what the outcomes of the two choices will be. And when we predict the future, what we all want to do is avoid costly errors. And in the prediction business, as most of you probably know, there are two types of errors: false positives and false negatives. A false positive error is when you adopt a belief that is not true. And a false negative error is when you reject a belief or fail to adopt a belief that is true. So, for example, when you see the leaves of a bush rustling and believe there's a lion there, but there is not, that's a false positive error, sometimes called a type 1 error. When you see the leaves of a bush rustling and think that's just the wind, no worries, but there is a lion there, that's a false negative error, sometimes called a type 2 error. So if you will, for a moment, think of Yogi's fork in the road as a choice between these two types of error. What EMT states is that if over evolutionary time, the costs of the two types of error in a decision domain that's related to fitness are asymmetric, natural selection will shape a cognitive bias to select the less costly error. And a bias is essentially a tendency to select one fork in the road with less evidence than you would require to select the other fork. So EMT is simply saying that over a certain set of conditions, biased reasoning is adaptive. So in the case of the rustling bush, it's less costly to have a bias that the lion is there when it is not. That is, it's less costly to err on the side of caution and make a false positive error. So false positive errors operate like smoke detectors or anxiety. It's safer to have false alarms. But there are other fitness-related domains where it's been less costly over evolutionary time to make false negative errors. For example, for male Homo sapiens, trying to decide whether to make a mating overture to a female, in that decision domain, the false negative cost of missing a mating opportunity is higher than the false positive cost of misreading sexual interest and being rejected. So natural selection has shaped males to overestimate the sexual interest of women, and instead of erring on the side of caution, to be guided by the principle, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So in a nutshell, EMT predicts that decision biases will evolve when three criteria are met. First, the decision has a recurrent impact on fitness. Second, the decision is based on incomplete or uncertain information. And third, the costs of the two types of errors are asymmetrical over evolutionary time. So here's a key thing about EMT then. It's saying that our cognitive biases are design features, not design flaws. That is, our decision biases are designed to minimize, they're not designed to minimize errors. They're designed to maximize fitness. And EMT has proven itself to be a very versatile theory, useful in explaining a wide variety of human behavior. One of the papers I posted for today's session had the intriguing title, The Paranoid Optimist. And it reviews many of these behaviors and concludes that we tend to be overly paranoid about the environment, including other people, but overly optimistic about ourselves. Another paper I posted used EMT to explain our tendency to believe in conspiracy theories. In short, if you're trying to decide if an out group is out to get you, false positives are less costly than false negatives. Hence, the tendency to be gullible to conspiracy theories. Two final brief thoughts, and then a question. It occurred to me that the logic of EMT has relevance to optimism and pessimism, and to belief formation. So optimism and pessimism as personality traits, that is, as generalized behavioral dispositions, are essentially probabilistic biases about overall positive and negative outcome rates in your life. Both optimists and pessimists make prediction errors. Optimists overestimate the number of positive events which will occur, and pessimists overestimate the number of negative events which will occur. Now, we know that pessimism is associated with depression, so over evolutionary time, the personality trait of optimism was probably the less costly error. As a result, the trait of optimism should have increased in the population and become more species typical than pessimism, which is arguably the case. Lastly, it occurs to me that EMT has something to say about social epistemology, which is the study of how communities influence knowledge. We all have to decide if we believe what our tribe believes. And in making that decision, we can make both types of errors. We can reject tribal claims that are true, or we can accept tribal claims that are false. So natural selection should make us prone to whichever type of belief error is less costly in terms of social support. I think it's a safe bet that false negative errors are more costly because that's the error that entails a rejection of a communally held belief. So we should have a cognitive bias towards false positive errors, that is, leaving the falsehoods that our tribe subscribes to. We sometimes call these adaptive fictions because they enhance fitness by ensuring continued social support. So the question I want to use to kick off our discussion is, do you see decision biases about how you behave, or about that decision biases about how you behave or what you believe, operating in your own life or in the lives of others? And if you do you find them helpful or harmful? So hopefully that was a reasonably quick and good introduction, and we can have a great discussion. Rob?
Can I just add a couple of things?
Sure.
One, the the evolutionary development of the lion in the bush is much used in anthropology to talk about why people believe in supernatural beings.
Mm-hmm.
And you're quite right that the positive error that it is a lion is the less costly version of it. There was postulated some kind of mental structure in the brain that was called the hyperactive agency detection device.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe invented by Justin Barrett, who wrote a book called Why Would Anyone Believe in God?
Mm-hmm.
Which you find out at the end, he's one of them. Um, uh,
Did not know that piece of
so
it.
that was one area to sort of that I've been thinking about, and the other is the Kahneman and Tversky's slow and fast thinking.
Mm.
Did you post a heuristics, little short heuristics paper?
Yeah, there was a
Mhm.
link
I
to
read that this morning and I was still a little groggy, so I'm not sure I got it right. But um, that seemed to be more the fast and slow thinking that they talk about. The fast thinking is the intuitive, jump to the conclusion, and the slow thinking is, reasoning it out and spending time on it. And sometimes the intuitive response is the right one because you don't have much time and you have to draw on your experience and your general disposition to make a decision.
Yeah, the hyperactive agency detection device really boils down to saying that our belief in supernatural beings, hence religion, is a result of error management theory and a decision bias that is created which one of the papers refers to as the illusion of animacy. That it's less costly to assume that events happening in the world are caused by intentional agents. That's the safer bet.
And
So,
that and
Andy,
that's
oh, go ahead,
I don't
Rob.
know, that's the foundation of religion uh, prior to book religions.
Yeah, at least that's one theory of the foundation of religion. Andy, you had your hand up, I saw.
Well, I'm just wondering if this personal anecdote represents counter evidence to EMT. So when I was in high school, I was petrified of asking a girl out and getting rejected, and so basically, I failed to make overtures that might have had actually gotten me some dates. Um, whereas this Buss and Haselton work seems to suggest that males should have the opposite bias, that we should be busy overestimating the sexual interest of women.
Mhm.
So what happened in my, either that's a counterexample or some overriding factor, maybe my anxiety or fear of rejection, uh, somehow tipped the balance there. What do y'all think?
That's a good question. Sage.
I, there's the point of development and also just personal like inheritance of your own genetic and experiential disposition. So yeah, anxiety, worried more of the false positive. Don't want to make that mistake. Um, but over evolutionary time, as a male, you also can take your time, right? And so maybe it's just not needed from where you trajected developmentally to have pursued that earlier, because there is a whole interesting point about adolescence as a unique opportunity of development where you're first able to basically pass on your genes, and the uncertainty of the rest of your life is probably at its highest. And so, that there's a spike in a shift in the logic there to be more overestimating in your mating opportunity. But perhaps you had a very secure environment that allowed you to say, I got time, right? Like I need to rush.
Well, the other way to think about it is that it's the different. There's individual variation, and so the research that supports the fact that men tend to overestimate sexual interest is group data. If you have 1,000 men, a statistically significant proportion of them will do this. At the risk of being a bit flippant, Andy, somebody that would make your choice, ultimately Darwin will weed you out. But I know you have two kids, so you've beaten the odds.
Well, wait,
Why are you still here?
I have an answer to that. A well-meaning friend who was concerned about my lack of a love life took me aside and actually had to coach into me what natural selection should have put into me from the very beginning.
Okay,
wait,
Hank.
I wanted to add to
Oh,
that,
go ahead,
so
Sage.
that the relationship of one's environment, your neighborhood context, let's say your family context growing up, the more risky, uncertain, dangerous that is, I would expect that the more you're going to want to take that overestimation of opportunity, more risky behavior. Um, and so that's like the story. I have to wager that Andy didn't grow up in a neighborhood in which you felt like you might be attacked on the street, you might not even make it past 25. Um, so risky behavior is associated with that environment, and that's a key point of like overall life history strategy.
Fair point. Thank you, gentlemen. I don't need this to become a extended discussion on my failures of my
Yeah, we could devote the February session to it, Andy, if you would like. Hank and then Ken.
Yeah, well, two things. One, just to state the obvious that we've come up with sort of evolutionary rules and concepts, and I think this discussion just reflects that there are exceptions to the rule, and people are, just uh, articulating various variables that might affect these rules, let's say, these beliefs. So that's just one. But the other, I kind of came up with a very simple learning lesson for myself as as I've read some of the stuff. And I said, I'm thinking of surviving, which is survival, life and death, and thriving. And that, just a minute. So for survival, oh God, I lost track. I'll get back to it. Let somebody else start, but I lost track of my other thought. Yeah.
Okay. All right. We've all been there, Hank.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ken.
I was just about to say that in a particular circumstance, there are different kinds of threat. There's environmental threat, there's social threat, but there is individual psychological threat. And therefore, it may differ for different people in a certain circumstance. One might argue that someone who has a whole lot of confidence might not be concerned about rejection. And so it gets very complicated. The question is, where do you see the threat?
Right. Again, I think we're talking about the fact that there is individual variability in all of this, but I don't think we should take that so far as to say these decision biases don't exist in our species, because the research evidence shows that they do. Sage.
I'd like to say it's not there's exceptions to the rule. It's just that there are layered evolutionary processes.
Yeah.
And all evolutionary processes are selecting at some resolution, if you will, and leaving a lot of the rest isn't important, right? It's not optimizing, it's just relative. So over a species, we have these broad biases, but over a lifetime, then we could describe it as individual variation, and obviously there's a piece of it, but development is the meeting of the individual to their actual context. And really that's where people either live or die or thrive or survive. And so those can become very salient. And I also think it's interesting to think about how in certain contexts that can be stable enough as to not provide variation. Like if everybody is basically doing pretty well or doing pretty poorly, you're going to see different higher level strategies of risk and, whatever come into play at the group level. So it's also like group difference is feeding down as well.
And also that's very interesting what you just said, but also at the end where you talked about contextual differences, one of the papers that we read made the point that the relative cost benefit ratio of the two types of error is about the same decision domain and can change in a different context.
Right.
Yeah. The one that recurs to me is that there is they talked about a forgiveness bias in relationships, which is that there's a general tendency to underestimate how contrite a romantic partner is, right? And that may have been adaptive because it would mean more effort would be put into reparation. And the research shows that relationships that are more troubled have more of that bias operating than relationships that are more secure. So even the same bias can change the cost dynamics can change depending upon the context.
Wow.
Hank and then Andy.
Okay. So my simplified thinking is that uncertainty is very dangerous when it comes to survival and very complex when it comes to thriving. Just to start at a baseline that, and then so that's one part, and then what we understand about in the neurobiology of the brain, that survival aspect in the limbic system is at the baseline, and that it affects like when we're in context of thriving. So as a therapist, you'll see a lot of this when people are dysregulated. Basically, that uncertainty becomes extremely powerful, but we need more of the prefrontal cortex to help mediate the limbic system and what gets communicated. And people can be very terrible at it.
Yeah, that's I I haven't tried to translate this into the neurobiology, but my knee-jerk reaction to what you said is that I don't think these biases are just in the limbic system. I think they're in the cortex as
Oh,
well.
no, I'm just starting with the base.
Okay.
Oh no, it's in the neocortex too. But I'm saying what eventually uh, uh, sort of filters through the neocortex is this limbic system. I think whoever said that, the danger detector.
Yep.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the neocortex mediates what the limbic system
Oh,
tells us.
okay.
And so I just wanted to put it in that perspective.
Yep.
Yeah. So definitely in both domains. Yeah.
Makes sense, Hank. Andy.
Yeah, just one quick question of clarification, and then maybe a more interesting question. You compute expected value by what? Costs times the likelihood, or benefits times likelihood. And the idea here is that natural selection should try to maximize expected value.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's asymmetric costs, then that should be balanced by asymmetric likelihoods, or by a bias that skews our error proneness in the opposite direction, so as to balance it out. Am I
Yes,
understanding the math right?
yes, I believe so. Yep.
Okay.
Well stated.
So here's the maybe the more interesting. Am I remembering right that Haselton and Meadow talk about a sort of a systematic bias in the institution of science, where you're not
Mm-hmm.
supposed to publish something unless you're darn sure it's proven?
Right. Right.
Because we want.
Statistical significance is a bias towards type 1 error.
Mhm.
I believe.
There we go. And meaning type 1, meaning that we want to have more false positives.
Negatives.
We want to have more false negatives. Okay. So here's here are a couple of the cultural conditions that might lead to that bias. And again, we're talking here about a cultural institution. So there are probably other stories to tell than simply the mechanics of natural selection doing its work. Now, the modern natural sciences were born in the wake of Descartes' meditations, which basically said, whenever I try to build on shaky foundations, shit crumbles. So let's wipe the slate clean, imagine that we know nothing, and then carefully rebuild our knowledge step by step, making sure that only proven things are led into the favored club.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, modern natural sciences have used that basic heuristic. Everything is guilty until proven innocent, but you have to prove something before it can be added to the corpus of science.
Mm-hmm.
But if we have that bias, that everything is guilty until proven innocent bias, then we can be fairly certain that the stuff that is incorporated in the corpus is reliable.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that's one story you could tell about that, where the origins of the systemic bias in science might come from. It's
Mm-hmm.
worth noticing in this context that when Anthony Fauci was, I think, the director of the AIDS task force back in the 80s or something under Reagan, he was trying to be really careful, be a gatekeeper to science, not let unproven AIDS cures be put into use, until he finally started meeting with a lot of people who were the loved ones of people who were dying from AIDS. And they were like, there are very real costs to being ultra cautious here about
Yes.
manning the gates of science. You need to loosen up, buddy, so that our loved ones don't die. And Fauci apparently had a bit of an epiphany where he actually had to kind of completely rethink US AIDS policy so as to get untested treatments to people who didn't have any other options.
Didn't have any other. You mentioned Fauci, and it just to take a slightly curveball reaction to that. When I was thinking about false negatives and false positives, it made me think about what we all just lived through in the pandemic. And there's never been, and I'm not just referring to, home tests and what the ratio of false positives and false negatives are, We were all in our everyday decisions about where to go and what to do and who to be with. We were all painfully aware of the cost of false negatives and false positives and trying to weigh those. I can never think of it. I don't think of any other time in my life where I was so conscious of the idea of false positives and false negatives about everyday decisions. And so it's
Well,
timely in that fashion. Um, Sage and then Hank, and I'd love to hear from Dave and Scott, who haven't joined in yet, if you have some thoughts. Go ahead, Sage, and then Hank.
Sure. Um, so I wanted to touch on the social epistemology piece a little bit, and to share one way of thinking. When does this come in? So, in any situation, we can choose, but either to rely on our own individual learning, our own history, or the social learning, that of a larger group, and their past, which can include cultural history going back much longer. And so there's a kind of basic model that, if the cost of the decision is high and the uncertainty is high, then that's going to lead to a bias towards social learning and cultural learning. And what's interesting about culture and social learning is how much it follows these rules, this kind of heuristic of maximizing for fitness, not for accuracy. And
Hmm.
we learn ways of doing things, how to, you know, perform a task, or what to focus on, what are important things, all these things we learn. We will keep all kinds of erroneous details and things that aren't important, and just kind of use it all, because the costs of making changes to optimize, to improve things, that might be the string that holds a lot of things together we didn't really understand. And so now we're all over the place. So we don't like innovate on things we learn from others that much, right? And so it's interesting how that can create paths. And then I just wanted to share some of the biases that come into play when we choose who to model, who to learn from. So this is especially interesting with what Andy has said about science. Um, so on the one hand, that norm creates like we can trust and rely on the published literature more than, things that aren't peer reviewed. But so assuming that still doesn't tell us what of the thousands and thousands of papers we should focus on. What is right, right? We don't know until later what really was proven true, because you cannot prove as much as you can really disprove. So we still find ourselves focusing on the same social learning biases, things like success, who's the most successful, prestige, who are the most other people talking about, also conformity bias, what are the most people around me focused on?
mhm.
And then the process of actually learning can do things like blend definitions. So you sort of take your best guess at the few best sources, your limited sample, and kind of average those together. And then so all these things come in play, and it's interesting that you the scientific truth paradigm, you know, can still remain, but we still have to make choices that doesn't provide the rest of the way. And that does create, ironically, biases in the literature as it's actually used that may be off from what is true. So the truth value of the literature itself by those metrics, it's different heuristics, right? Not accuracy per se.
Interesting. It's the best we've come up with, though, Sage, right? The best system that we've come up with for figuring out what is true
Yeah.
and what is false. Yeah. Um,
Well, just to add to that, is that's where the replication crisis and the focus
yes.
on replication comes in, I think, as strengthening of that norm to say, don't just assume everything is true, still hold a
Hmm.
certain level of doubt. And then when something is actually not able to be disproven because it's shown again, okay, so a higher standard is coming at play, where any one study no more today really can say anything. It's got to be followed up on and expanded.
Right. All knowledge is provisional, right? You hold it. That's the essence of science. Is you hold it provisionally. I remember in graduate school it was hammered into me that you would never say that a study proved anything. All you would say is that the word was it supported something,
Mhm.
never proved it.
Right.
I think Hank and then
Yeah.
Andy.
Well, just to be a little playful, Sage, you read my mind because you didn't know what I was going to bring up. But the way I was going to bring it up in the order that the way I thought it before you spoke was, can we take one of these based on how we're talking, and especially what Sage brought up? Can we talk about the phenomenon, the 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 what Trump is, how Trump is affecting the social the social learning, the way you described it, Sage? So I'll be presumptuous, and would you do something with that? Because I can't. But I think it's the way we're talking. I can't think quick enough to put it together because this is sort of reasonably unfamiliar information for me. So I don't have it down yet, but I'm gonna learn about it more. But I'm just suggesting this, and of course I can only
My
gently ask you.
my
Yeah,
two
I would say that that a lot of people are making a false positive error when it comes to Trump.
Yes,
That would be my brief summary
yeah,
of it. But
right. But what I'm getting at is to look at the mechanisms uh, from in the context of how we're speaking today.
my 2 cents would be that in the context of a populist candidate, then human universals are going to be the most powerful way to get the vote. And so these things are definitely at play in a way that Democrats just are
Right.
not as good at and end up thinking too literally almost about the topics at hand, as opposed to the fact
Yeah.
that at the end, all that matters is how many
Okay.
people vote.
Yeah. But
Doesn't actually matter
what
what people think.
yeah. What I'm getting at, because I can't speak to it well, is that what kind of biases are created in terms of false positives or false negatives for this particular, it's a grouping. Individuals are different, but this grouping has something in common about the universals. But what are the mechanisms that Trump, the spokesperson for this kind of stuff, is operating on from the context of, is this about fitness and cost benefit? I mean, to be a little more precise,
I think they use, Hank, one way to think about it is that and maybe all politicians do this. It's unfair maybe of me to just attribute this to one partisan side, but they use cognitive biases to gain power. So, for example, populists tend to use our conspiracy gullibility. I talked earlier in my introduction
uh,
about how we have a built-in cognitive bias it's safer to believe in a conspiracy because if there really is one and you're wrong, the stakes are super high. And so populist politicians, I think, tend to use that cognitive bias. They stoke
uh-huh.
it and use it to their advantage.
Okay, let me use the language that
Let's,
I'm
Hank, I'm going to stop
just
you because I don't want to go off too far into politics and
no, no,
Trump.
no. This is not politics. I don't want to keep. I'm
Okay.
keeping it away. Is this based on the movement? This direction between fitness and accuracy? See, I don't know the language to talk about in that context. That's all. It's not
Mhm.
politics.
Well, that actually is a perfect segue to the question I was going to ask, if that's all right.
Yep.
Um, Thank you for asking that, Hank. So, right, there's a famous argument for why you should believe in God that says you should believe in God because if you're right, you'll
Yeah.
be rewarded with heaven and a huge pragmatic payoff. And if you're wrong, you're screwed, eternity in hell, huge negative payoff. And what philosophers, when you teach Pascal's wager, that's the argument.
Yep.
I mean, invariably the question comes up, well, should you believe in God because it's useful to believe it, or should we be believing in God because we have reason for thinking it's true that he exists?
Thank
Right.
you.
So philosophers call that distinction epistemic and pragmatic, the first being pragmatic, the second being epistemic. And part of the training of a scientist is to say, you know what, we try not to believe things simply because it's useful or advantageous to believe them in science. We try to believe things in science only if we have sufficient reason for thinking they're true. So I think that's true to a first approximation, but tell me if that clean distinction doesn't break down at the second level. When you're trying to balance false positives and false negatives, you need to strike some kind of pragmatic balance, right? You can't be so fearful of embracing a falsehood within science that you say believe nothing unless it's proved to a mathematical certainty. If we tried to if we erred on the side of error avoidance to the exclusion of our interests in truth attainment, we'd end up with a bias that excludes too much.
Well, that Andy, two things occur to me. One is science does not want adaptive fictions to be in the knowledge, the canon of knowledge. We all have adaptive fictions as individual human beings, but science in a way is an effort to exclude adaptive fictions from being in the canon of knowledge. The other thing I would say is that the sort of balancing act you're describing, it can be regulated by where you set your statistical significance level. If you set it at 0.01 versus 0.05, you've making a different calculus about what the balance I think I hear you referring to.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm asking is, don't pragmatic considerations come into play when we try to set that threshold? So you can set the statistical significance threshold really high, in which case you get fewer false positives, but more false negatives. You can set it low, and then you have the opposite problem. And if you think at all about the costs and benefits of making those different kinds of errors, then pragmatic considerations are coming in at the second or the third level, even if they're not supposed to be coming in at the first level of scientific thinking. Am I thinking about this right?
Yeah, let me hear. Dave, you're nodding. Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, my name is Dave Chambers. I'm new to this group. Obviously, I'm new to pro-social stuff.
Well, welcome.
I find this extremely
Howdy.
enlightening. Steve is doing a wonderful job of facilitating, and there's some smart people I'm looking at on this screen. I'm learning a lot. My intent is to keep my mouth shut. You guys are not helping me at all by raising very interesting things to talk about. I'm interested in the relationship between research and practice because I work in a dental school and I'm interested in the health professions. And what I'm finding is that the two domains of science and practice are moving apart from each other. And the scientific domain seems to be fighting a very defensive battle. We can perfect the science. And Andy's comment about the true and the useful is a good point on this because the scientific community is arguing let's be true, and the practice community is arguing, but tell us something I can do something with.
Right.
And I'm finding that the major thing I'm finding in this research is that it's very hard to get these kinds of papers published.
Interesting. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Because the research community says, no, wait a minute, our job is to perfect the research community. So
Dave,
why are you talking about this other stuff about it's being useful or not? And Andy's point about Descartes is true. And in the 18th century, we were worried about, let's find what is really true. The current thinking on science is pretty heavily influenced by Karl Popper. And his view is, let's find out what's false. It isn't worth saying much about unless it is provable to be false, but has not been proven false by good effort. And I've said too much. Again,
It,
I'm learning a great deal. Stop me from talking. I want to listen to you guys.
David,
it,
that's your cognitive bias. I like to hear more, but
it,
I'm
it,
not
Yeah,
it,
running.
David, that was great.
it,
Keep
it
keep
made me
talking, my
think,
friend. You fit in well.
it made me think of Martin Baudry's work on adaptive fictions. And there's a great TED talk by him that might interest you. And in a nutshell, what what he argues is that even though adaptive fictions are false but useful, we should try to find things that are true that serve the same function if we can. So I think the sweet spot, whether one is a practitioner or a researcher or just a human being, going about your day-to-day life, at least for me, is to find is to find things that are useful and also true. I guess. I don't know if I've expressed that. I've expressed that well. I suppose, the question is, if ignorance is bliss, would you choose ignorance? I would rather not have bliss and have truth, but that's just me. Sage, go ahead.
I wanted to make a point around the philosophy of science that is pro-social worlds processes are based around, which is functional contextualism, which is both an approach to doing science that is, it's an approach to doing science that's less focused on an ontology, on defining categories of things and that these things are true and this is how they interact and that that's an accurate model of what is actually there, and defining it in terms of basically what we know about the world as it actually occurs, and worrying less about what we call things and more about patterns. So and then fundamentally it's practical. So what works actually tells you something meaningful as a signal about what's true in a practical way. But because it works, then there's something there to be examined, right? Of all the things you could do. And so building from that, there's still an aim to understand, in this case, behavior through generalized behavioral patterns. We want to still be able to describe things in a general way, but we're working our way up there from what do people do rather than just sort of creating whole theories of behavior that are basically just, combinations of ideas that are you're testing the relationship of two components, and that somehow means that, it's like, yeah.
That's really helpful. The one thing I would say about error management theory, which was unknown to me until about a month ago, so everything I know about it has been in the last couple of weeks of reading whatever I could find on it. One of the hallmarks of a good theory in science is its heuristic value and its parsimony. And the reason why Darwin's theory of natural selection is considered maybe one of the greatest scientific theories ever is that it hits the ball out of the park on both of those counts. It is extremely parsimonious, right? And yet it can explain such a wide array of phenomena. And that was the reaction I had as I began to learn about error management theory. Its logic is very simple, but it has very, very wide explanatory power. It can apply to any system at any level that has asymmetric costs. It can apply to technology as well as living organisms. I think if David Sloan Wilson was here, it would be really interesting to have him talk about error management theory as it applies to group selection and multi-level selection.
Steve, I think you
Yeah.
can actually make that last claim about the generality of EMT even more broadly. EMT should apply wherever there's an evolved system that has to make discriminations to make in order to
As long as there's different costs in the discriminations. Yes.
So it would have to be an evolved system that's capable of choosing among options, and that tries to gather information from its environment in order to choose the best one. Then the biases predicted by Darwin and EMT should kick in, right?
Yes. Yeah. Hank.
Yeah, since I've been here a while, but I'm still learning. So I ask my questions as a learner and trying to organize my thoughts. So my question is this: does error management theory contribute to fitness and or usefulness? And what's the balance? I mean, I can't answer it. I'm just trying to make sense.
Well,
If I get,
fitness is usefulness, I think. Um,
yeah.
As opposed to accuracy.
Oh,
exactly.
okay. That's the other. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. That's better. That's what I'm trying to get together. Does it
Yeah.
contribute to accuracy, truth, or usefulness and or fitness?
It's not interested in minimizing error. It's interested in maximizing fitness.
Let me make a fine point on something that just sparked for me, which is that
Yeah.
the functional contextualists look at human behavior in that way because that is how human behavior is organized.
Yeah.
It's organized
Around
by relative outcome and consequence, not by accuracy of prediction. What you do next is about what's going to happen, not whether
Yeah.
it's a model in your head.
In some ways, it's somewhat Skinnerian. It has
Oh, it's definitely starts from behaviors, only that much more generous view of other forms of
right.
inheritance.
Right.
Skinner has said things like, well, they would believe if two identical organisms, let's say genetic twins, experience the exact same environment throughout their lives, they should have the exact same behavior.
Right. I didn't mean it in that sense. I meant it in the sense that one could talk about cost and benefits of the asymmetric decisions between the errors, and you could talk about that in terms of rewards and punishments.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
just one thing in this area. So can we think of accuracy of prediction as a fictional narrative?
um it's fictional if you believe you can ever finally know truth that isn't provisional and that it's 100% and you're mapping on reality to 100%. Your truth always has to be provisional and you can probably never map on reality 100%.
So
Andy,
it's
you're
the
the
process.
epistemologist.
Yeah. So
You
it's
tell
a
us.
process, right? Just one more thing, but it's a process rather than an
Yes,
end game. Okay.
I think so. Rob?
All right.
We're into this notion of prediction, and wanted to raise the idea of intelligent truth telling or intelligent forecasting. When you talk about the future, if you overemphasize its disastrous consequences, people will turn off.
Mm-hmm.
If you underemphasize the urgency of the problem, people won't hear you. So you have to find exactly the right balance when you're talking about the future. But the other thing about talking about the future is that if people listen to you, the future changes.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're wrong, or you were wrong.
That's interesting. I'm thinking, of course, of climate change. If
Yeah,
if people do begin, if you find that sweet spot between neither being underly alarming or overly alarming, and people do listen to you and solve the problem, you prove yourself wrong, in a
exactly.
sense.
Yeah,
But not really, because what you're really part of what you're predicting is part of the prediction, unstated is, and if you listen to me, the future will be different.
yeah.
Yeah,
But that's often forgotten in the process.
yeah,
And the
that's
anti
fascinating.
people will use that as an example of how you were wrong. See,
Yeah.
the climate's not as bad as you said it was going to be.
Right, right.
Yep.
Yeah. Andy.
Yeah, I wanted to build on something Dave said before. He brought up Karl Popper's philosophy of science, which centers on the notion of falsification. That as an epistemologist, here's a simplified tale of the history of epistemology. Starting with Descartes, Western philosophy became obsessed with a kind of epistemology that treats everything as guilty until you can prove it innocent, or everything's unjustified until you can prove it justified. And that view held sway well into the early 20th century, or even the middle 20th century, when Karl Popper said, wait a second, guys, you know, we have all these puzzles we can't, philosophical puzzles we can't solve. We should toss out this confirmationism, which tries to start with zero and build up. And we should essentially accept a bunch of things provisionally and start weeding out the bad stuff. So instead of adding good stuff, we should weed out the bad stuff. And I think he was right that science, to a significant extent, works that way. But a very, very crude version of Popper's epistemology would be the following: accept everything as true provisionally, and then just, unless it gets falsified, in which case you can scratch it off the list. But notice that uses an extremely indiscriminate initial rule: accept everything. The same way the confirmationists and the Cartesians started with an utterly indiscriminate starting point: believe nothing unless you can prove it. But I argued in my dissertation and in my book that both of those approaches are overly reliant on hugely indiscriminate starting rules. And that in effect, and EMT helps me explain that better now than I ever could before, because if we're in fact creatures that evolved to manage error and to have discriminating mechanisms that try to find a sweet spot between the costs on one side and the costs on the other, then we should bring fairly discriminating epistemic sensibilities even before we start doing epistemology or science or philosophy. Just right, even our cave-dwelling ancestors had fairly discriminating epistemic sensibilities that they could rely on under a broad range of circumstances. And if that's our real starting point, then the job of philosophy, epistemology, and science should be to try to progressively refine that initial starting point. So if we take our epistemic intuitions about what's true and false as prima facie reliable, and then we start examining them carefully and weeding out the bad ones and amping, turning up the dial on the good ones, then what we're really doing is kind of modifying in a Bayesian way, through probability updating, a set of intuitions that are handed to us by evolution, but are continually modified in the course of experience.
Andy, let me ask you a question, because this is what occurred to me as you were beginning to explain that. So when you sort of posited two choices in terms of how we can construct knowledge, and to oversimplify it, we can adopt an innocent until proven guilty approach, or a guilty until proven innocent approach. What the logic of EMT would simply say is, which of those two choices has more costs? And so tell me which does. It seems to me that there's more costs in assuming everything is true until it's proven false than vice versa. Right? I mean, what would epistemologists say?
It does seem, well, philosophers have always been have been more interested in weeding out the bad stuff than in piling up the good stuff. Meanwhile, scientists have been engaged primarily in piling up the good stuff. And weeding out some bad stuff.
It would seem to me that the sort of epistemological position in terms of living one's life in a Darwinian sense and surviving would be to not be overly credulous. Yes, I think it would be less costly to say I need claims to be supported before I believe them. There's too much risk the other way.
I guess I would accept that at a very high level, but then argue that contextual considerations rapidly enter in to make these things more domain specific.
Yeah.
But the way we should err, either towards credulity or skepticism, rapidly becomes more fine-grained.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction. And back in my introductory remarks, when I was talking about optimism and pessimism, you notice I went out of my way to talk about the trait of optimism or pessimism, which is a generalized disposition. Of course, what EMT is going to say is that whether you should be optimistic or pessimistic is domain specific, and it's not always going to be the same. Hank, and then Sage, and then Rob, and then before we do end, I have a suggested topic for next month I want to toss out and see how people feel about it. But Hank, Sage, and Rob.
Okay, so I'm bringing this back to my own expertise, and that has to do, is mental health, psychotherapy, psycho theory about how the humans work. So, one of you mentioned this uh, overly alarming or underly alarming. I
Yeah,
forget.
I said those words, I
Yeah,
think.
very powerful. So when you think about what I call cognitive emotional dysregulation, in other words, if you have emotional dysregulation, you're going to have cognitive dysregulation. So what happens in the clinical setting is that, people are messed up. They can't think straight. They can't make decisions. They get anxious. They get depressed. But that's when the individual equilibrium has gone awry. So the work is to help people with dysregulation, going over alarming or catastrophizing or
Hmm.
shutting down or freezing. So
Hmm.
just this thinking is just helping me think in the context of where I spend most of my life. So I want to thank, this is a great session for me on a lot of levels too. And the
Read
thinking that
read
goes on.
read Nessie's book, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings,
Yeah.
Good reasons for bad feeling.
by
Good.
by Nessie, Neese.
Okay.
I think I said Sage and then Rob. Yeah.
I just really wanted to emphasize Andy's use of the word intuition. I hadn't quite caught that piece, and I think it's uh, right on it because what you're really saying is take what is true, provisionally what I already know to be true, and accepting at some level that part of what that knowledge, that truth feeling is feeling, right? And it's like there's where the kind of deeper subconscious biases, the evolutionary piece, but also we do all in a certain sense start from our evolutionary path, but then quickly we're 6 years old, we've learned a lot. And so we're not really starting from this blank position ever in practice, right? From the moment we're alive, there's examples of how we should do things. Um,
Hmm.
and so I think that's a behaviorist, a functionalist behaviorist approach. And it's because for me, it's all linked by consequentialism. That's the link between this and evolutionary thought. Uh,
Hmm.
so yeah.
Nicely stated. Nicely stated, Sage. Rob?
I just want to ask if I can say that I believe that belief is always a dangerous delusion.
Mm.
You can say that. I'm not sure what you mean by it. What you want to expand
You
on
can
that
say
a little
whatever
bit?
you want.
I like the not in believing that belief is a dangerous delusion because it contradicts itself.
Okay. All right. Let me wrap up just by saying one thing and then tossing out an idea for next month. Um, just to go back to discussing optimism and pessimism. My favorite definition of a pessimist, and this maybe pertains to functional contextualism, Sage. My favorite definition of a pessimist is that he is just a fellow that looks both ways before crossing a one-way street.
I do that.
So here's my suggestion for next month, and I'll tell you the simple title and then elaborate on it briefly. So I was thinking about self-esteem as a topic. And that was before Andy was talking about his high school days. I will have you know. Uh, but years ago, I read a paper by David Buss and the co-author was Hill. I forget the co-author's first name, in which they posit an evolutionary theory of self-esteem, which basically talks about self-esteem in terms of self-assessments of how you measure up compared to others in domains that are relative to fitness. That also that can explain some sex differences in what domains are relevant to self-esteem for men versus women. Um, there's also the issue of whether self-esteem is global or whether it's really appropriate to talk about self-esteems. In other words, that that the way I apprise myself may be high in one domain and low in another domain. So I think self-esteem is an interesting topic, and evolution has something new to say about it. So that would be my, and there's just really, I think we could just read this one paper by Hill and Buss, and it would give us enough fodder to have a discussion about it. So I'm curious what people think about that. I'm open to other topic ideas, but anybody really opposed to self-esteem as a topic? Okay. All right.
That
So
sounds good, Steve. I think you just outed me as a low status male in my school, but
no, just a late bloomer, Andy, I think is the way to describe it. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I hope some of you, if you haven't read some of those papers, the one, if you only read one of them, I think the best one to read would be the one by Haselton and Nettles.
Yes.
Nettle or whatever, I forget the second name.
Very good, yeah.
It's probably it's the one that begins with all the math.
good.
But it's really a good paper, and it summarizes a lot of this. And if you only read one thing, that would be it. And again, I found error management theory one of the more exciting things I've come across in a long time, because of its heuristic value, as I was talking about earlier. So at any rate, thanks everybody. We'll see you next month, if not sooner.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Great to
Bye.
see
I'm
you
all pumped. I'm all pumped, guys.
Okay. Bye-bye.